Wonderful. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Aleksandra Kazmierczak. I'm originally from Poland, so really nice to see so many Eastern neighbors at this meeting. And I'm working at the European Environment Agency. As Markus mentioned, last year we published a report focusing on urban adaptation to climate change in Europe. Just to start, why are we focusing on urban issues so much? Well, first of all, we know that climate change is our reality, that no matter how much we reduce the emissions, we still need to adapt to the impacts of climate change on our lives. And these impacts are most likely to be felt really strongly in cities and towns. And this is because cities contain the most of the European population. They are also the economic engines for growth, but also it's because their social and physical characteristics really can make the climate impacts either much worse or mitigate these impacts for the population and for their assets and activities in the cities. And finally, it's because the local authorities actually have the set of competencies in terms of land use planning, for example, or social care, that make them the ideal implementers of adaptation solutions. So in terms of the risks from climate for the European cities, there are many, but probably the most pronounced one is heat. And if you look at this slightly complicated map on the left-hand side, it is showing as this grid of squares the risk of extreme heat waves occurring in the near future, and the darker the color, the higher the number of projected extreme heat waves. And the dots are showing the urban heat island effect in the summer for the cities. The darker the color, the more intensive the urban heat island. And you can see that both of them, the projected extreme heat waves and the urban heat island effect, are really focusing in the south and southeastern part of Europe, creating possibly very difficult conditions for people to live in the summer. When we zoom in into the cities, we can also see that there might be issues for some of the most vulnerable facilities in cities. So we looked at the distribution of hospitals in relation to urban heat island. And of course, hospitals need to be accessible for the population, so they tend to be in the city centers, but that really makes them exposed to heat, both from the changing climate and the urban heat island effect, really making them very urgent object of adaptation. Looking at another type of climate risk to cities, pluvial flooding, we are expecting an increase in extreme precipitation in winter in the east and northeast of Europe in particular. And if cities have a high percentage of sealed surfaces, asphalt or tarmac or buildings, it makes them quite prone to pluvial flooding. So, for example, one of the Polish cities has 36% of surface sealing, and it's also likely to be exposed to a lot of precipitation, heavy precipitation in winter in the future, increasing the risks of flooding. So what has been done about addressing these risks in Europe? From the strategic and policy perspective, actually quite a lot. Since the publication of the EU adaptation strategy in 2013, most of the countries, all of the EU countries and most of the countries that the European Environment Agency is working with have implemented either a national adaptation strategy or a national adaptation plan. And most of them actually highlight the subnational governments and urban level as the main actors for implementing the adaptation solutions. We've also really seen an exponential growth in terms of the numbers of signatories to the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy that are committed to adaptation, and the number of different policies and initiatives that really emphasize the need to adapt in cities. And this emphasis is likely to continue because, as we can see in the new adaptation strategy that was just launched a month ago, it emphasizes the importance of urban adaptation. It mentions that the local level is really the bedrock and that the EU efforts must increase local resilience. So all looks really good in terms of the planning and the strategic level, but when we look at what's happening in the individual cities and towns, the picture is a bit different. In the scope of the report, we looked at how the signatories to the Covenant of Mayors assessed their own progress on adaptation planning. And in this graph, the darker the color, the more advanced the signatories assess themselves. And we can see that at the stage of assessing risks and vulnerabilities and at the stage of identifying the options of implementation, there is a big proportion of signatories that say, yes, we are quite advanced on that. But as we go further towards the implementation of actions and towards the monitoring and evaluation, we can see that the dark blue starts to disappear. And it means that fewer and fewer local authorities are actually implementing the actions and monitoring the actions as we sort of go from the sort of planning stage to the implementation stage. So there's really a very urgent need to transform this commitment to adaptation and the planning into implementation and monitoring. When we look at the types of adaptation actions that are planned by cities, we can also see that many of them are actually what we call the soft actions, the ones that are, for example, aiming at development of knowledge through flood mapping or heat risk assessments, or the ones that are looking at mainstreaming adaptation into planning documents. Of course, these are very key actions, developing the knowledge or developing the sort of policy basis. But it also emphasizes that there isn't that many actions happening in real life and on the ground. And there is really an urgent need to implement more of those concrete or structural actions. So simply said, looking from the climate adaptation perspective, we need to change the way we plan and construct our cities. And urban green spaces or nature-based solutions more broadly are one of the excellent means to adapt to the changing climate. But again, when we look at the map, it shows that there is a really strong northwest-southeast divide in Europe when it comes to the availability of green spaces to the urban populations. So it shows that the same parts of Europe that are likely to be affected more by the changing climate in terms of the heat waves are also the ones that don't provide the green infrastructure that could provide a bit of protection for the populations. We also still see that there is a lot of development in the floodplains around the rivers flowing through many of the European cities. And there is also a need for adaptation there, either removing the development or changing it, such as, for example, in this case of a Hungarian city of Miskolc, into an area that can easily be flooded without causing too much damage. But of course, to be able to implement the concrete actions, cities need money. And actually, in every survey results I've seen run for the cities on the barriers to adaptation, the funding, the budgetary capacity comes absolutely on top. So here is an example of the barriers and supporting factors mentioned by cities reporting to the CDP initiative. And this budgetary capacity is the main barrier to implementing adaptation. And also it's because most of the cities are actually using their own resources to fund adaptation. So there is a big gap here in terms of the expectations and the national adaptation strategies stating, well, the local level is the main actors for implementation of adaptation, but at the same time, the resources don't seem to follow that, and many of the European cities are actually using their own resources for adaptation. Also, in terms to be able to spend the public money in a sensible way, the cities need to be sure that they are investing in actions that are actually effective for climate change adaptation. And here our knowledge is not so well developed. We actually don't have so much evidence about the effectiveness of different actions in terms of adapting to climate change. And it's partly because adaptation is difficult to measure. It's not like reducing the emissions where there is one simple way to measure the progress. For example, if we look at heat, we can look at measuring the reduction in outdoor temperature or indoor temperature, or the use of energy for cooling, and so on and so on. And it's quite difficult. It means that the monitoring of the effectiveness of actions really needs to be designed in at the beginning of the adaptation planning or the selection of adaptation actions process, and not added at the end. And because it's can be quite a resource heavy exercise to monitor the effectiveness of adaptation actions, involving other stakeholders such as researchers or private sectors, or even citizens through the citizen science approaches, is one of the ways to monitor the progress. When it comes to the support to urban adaptation offered from national level in Europe, we could see that most of the countries really engaged the local level, not necessarily the individual cities, but for example, the local authority association, in the process of developing the national adaptation strategies and plans, to make sure that they're really on board and that their needs are taken into consideration. In some of the European countries, actually adaptation planning at the local level, or risk assessments at the local level, are required through the national law. So it's a regulatory requirement for the cities to adapt to climate change, such is, for example, the case in Denmark, and countries like Sweden or the Netherlands, they require risk assessments from the municipality level. In other countries, for example, Slovakia or Slovenia, there is a requirement to include adaptation criteria in the spatial and urban planning. So the spatial law is actually a vehicle for climate change adaptation. But we can see that some countries are also offering support to the local level through, for example, targeted funding, as in the case of Germany, or capacity building programs. So my home country of Poland has run two programs, one for large cities and one for small and medium-sized cities, supporting them in their climate adaptation activities. And of course, as just been discussed, climate adaptation portals are yet another means to support the local adaptation. I would like to finish with this slide and say two things. That first of all, there are plenty of international activities that could be exploited to encourage the local level to adapt. So the Covenant of Mayors and also the UNDRR Making Cities Resilient campaign, now called the Making Cities Resilient 2030 campaign, is a way to sort of incentivize the local authorities. But when we look at these two maps, we can see that there are big differences between the countries in terms of how many of the local authorities actually sign up to these international initiatives. And that's where the role of both the national governments and the regional governments in some countries is to activate the local level to take advantage of the support networks and knowledge exchange networks that exist at the international levels. That could be yet another way to work with the cities from the national level to encourage them to take part in the international initiatives. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I hope that you find it useful, and feel free to get in touch with me with any questions, and also have a look at the report if you find it useful for your activities. So thank you.